BookTV recently visited Capitol Hill to ask members of Congress what they're reading this summer.
First, Dead Wake, Erik Larson. I've read all of his works. This is a great book, sort of almost a minute-by-minute description of what happened to the Lusitania. And it's very dramatic, and it goes back and forth between what's happening in Europe and what's happening in Washington with President Wilson, and what's happening to the passengers on the ship, their stories. It's really a great read, well written, and I think really brings that piece of history in 1915 back to life. And really makes it very human. It's not cold history. These are real human beings we can relate to who often lost their lives, sadly, on Lusitania. Great story. The Illustris Dead by Stephen Talty is all about how typhus actually really was responsible for destroying Napoleon's army in the invasion of Russia. A lot of people thought it was the cold or it was the Russian army. All of those things didn't help, but the real killer was typhus. The sanitary conditions of the day simply didn't allow them to protect themselves against this bacterium, and it was devastating, really devastating. Napoleon lost more than 90% of his army in the invasion of Russia, and a lesson, by the way, that obviously a century and a half later, Adolf Hitler did not attend to his regret. A friend of mine, Elizabeth Varron, actually grew up across the street from me. She's a historian now at the University of Virginia, Dr. Elizabeth Varron, and she wrote a great book on Appomattox. And it's sort of a revisionist history, and in my view, a correct one, about what really the outcome of Appomattox, how Robert E. Lee and the South used and misused the agreement in Appomattox to foster sort of resegregation, resuppression of black Americans after the Union won the Civil War and slavery was supposed to be over. They essentially invoked the free spirit of Appomattox as meaning that none of them should be prosecuted for war crimes. Robert E. Lee had been indicted, actually, after the war, and he invoked Appomattox and insisted that U.S. Grant invoke the agreement they had to protect Robert E. Lee. Robert E. Lee, to his death, remained actually very reprobate on the issue of race in the South. He has a saintly view in some versions of history, but this is a pretty penetrating and compelling reassessment of how Appomattox and what the meaning of Appomattox was interpreted by the South and ultimately by the North really did damage for the next 90 years in terms of race in America. This book, Thomas Cromwell, by Tracy Borman, is a reappraisal of a very controversial and historic figure during the reign of Henry VIII. Those who are fans of St. Thomas More, who had been the Chancellor of England under Henry VIII and was ultimately beheaded because he would not agree to the remarriage of Henry VIII to Anne Boleyn, who also lost her head. Thomas Cromwell was the instrument of both securing the divorce in arguing for the separation of the Church in England from the Church in Rome, and ultimately for Thomas More's demise as well. Ultimately, ironically, Thomas Cromwell lost his head as well. But it's a maybe more sympathetic portrayal of a very skilled statesman, a very skilled manager who managed the Kingdom of England for Henry VIII, but who also is responsible for the destruction of the monasteries, the breakup of church holdings and property, and ultimately the severance of the relationship between England and the Church of Rome, and some of the real depredations that occurred under the reign of Henry VIII. Great read, and coincidentally comes out as people are watching Wolf Hall on public radio, also about Thomas Cromwell. This is the single best biography I've ever read of Napoleon. It's called Napoleon by Andrew Roberts, and in one volume it is a stupendous read and very accessible read about who Napoleon was and his triumphs and his failures. He won almost all of his battles, but unfortunately the ones he lost were pretty dispositive. He was a brilliant statesman, a brilliant manager, a brilliant general, but who kind of toward the end, I think maybe because of hubris, kind of lost sight of his own techniques, his own lessons learned, and ultimately they were turned against him. But this is a great read and a real reappraisal and reassessment of the importance of Napoleon, even down to modern history. Great read, must read. Scott Berg wrote this wonderful biography on Woodrow Wilson, also a bit of a reappraisal. Wilson, had this mix of incredible progressive record in the White House, especially in his first term, statesman during World War I, but also certainly a retrograde attitude toward race relations in America. But it's a great balanced read, and ultimately one appreciates sort of that progressive moment that Woodrow Wilson most certainly took advantage of to the benefit of America, in my view. Great single-volume biography of Woodrow Wilson. This book, 13 Days in September by Lawrence Wright, I love this book because it humanizes diplomacy. It talks about the Camp David Accords and the 13 days Anwar Sadat and Prime Minister Begin of Israel and Jimmy Carter spent together, not always harmoniously, at Camp David, and how that process worked out. Personalities, history, fears, anxieties, stresses, mistrust, the role of interlocutor by the president, Jimmy Carter. Jimmy Carter put a lot on the table, including his own reputation, and it worked. And the Camp David Accord to this day remains the only lasting peace accord in the Middle East. And Jimmy Carter deserves a lot of credit, as do the other two participants as well. But if you want to see how, at human levels, diplomacy actually works, great book. Got to be read by every graduate school that studies international studies. Another biography, Walter Isaacson, on Benjamin Franklin and American life, a wonderful biography. I mean, Benjamin Franklin comes through these pages as a very contemporary man. We would relate to him easily based on the portrayal in this book. On balance, this is a great man, great vision, lived a long life, had many episodes to that life as a political figure in Pennsylvania, as a political figure on behalf of the colonies in Europe, as a political figure back with the Declaration of Independence, back to Europe, representing now the Confederacy of America during the Revolutionary War, then comes back and actually serves as a key figure in the Constitutional Convention, helping to save the day, really, for that Constitutional Convention and arguing for it in what was a very close thing in the approval of the Constitutional Convention in the 13 states. Benjamin Franklin, bigger-than-life figure, quintessential American, homespun, shrewd, smart, entrepreneurial, represents so much of the American character. This is a wonderful biography. And finally, Dying Every Day. I happen to love ancient Roman history. This book by James Romm is all about the Roman poet Seneca, who was sort of the artist in residence at the court of Nero, and sort of the odd juxtapositions between this thoughtful man, Seneca, and this tyrant, Nero, and how he tried to survive in that time period while being, on the other hand, a very senior advisor to Nero. And it was a very tricky business. So it's a great piece of Roman history about a very controversial and not easy relationship, and a very easy and great read if you like ancient Roman history, as I do. So that's my summer reading for now, and I hope to be back next year with an equal number of recommendations.
And BookTV wants to know what you're reading this summer. Tweet us your answer at BookTV, or you can post it on our Facebook page, facebook.com/BookTV.